Right, let's dive straight in. Today, in this explainer, we're taking a really critical, fascinating look at the spaces we call home. Specifically, we're exploring a pretty wild contrast that essentially defines modern geography. England's historical, almost romantic love for vast open spaces pitted against the modern, incredibly claustrophobic reality of shrinking urban homes. In academic and legal research, this phenomenon is increasingly being described with this very evocative phrase, living cheek by jowl. But to understand how we ended up packed so tightly together, we actually need to step outside the city limits first.
Picture this. It's 1945, Britain has just come out of the war and they're facing a massive rebuilding effort, driven by a highly utopian vision. Prime Minister Clement Attlee envisioned building a new Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. The goal wasn't just throwing up houses as fast as possible. It was about balancing this desperate need for urban regeneration with a fierce, unwavering desire to protect the pristine countryside from being swallowed by endless suburban sprawl.
And that whole utopian vision, it was actually locked into law with the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, a piece of legislation that forever changed the English landscape. This landmark act introduced the concept of green belts on a national scale. We're talking about designated rings of protected rural land totally surrounding towns and cities. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. These spaces would serve as the green lungs of urban cores, improving air quality, boosting public well-being, and acting as a hard, non-negotiable boundary to keep the cities contained. And wow, did that legacy stick around. Today, a massive 12.6% of England's total land area is protected greenbelt. To put that into perspective, 65% of that protected land is actively used for agriculture. It's honestly an incredible achievement in land preservation. But there's a catch. By strictly containing the outward growth of cities, the pressure of a booming population and a prolonged housing crisis had to go somewhere. It couldn't go out, so it went up and it went in.
So what happens inside the city limits when those borders are essentially locked tight? Well, you get housing intensification. This is the proliferation of dense, high-rise, or heavily subdivided housing. And it's prompted by a crazy mix of formal urban planning needs, the aggressive pressure of global real estate markets, and just the informal, everyday ways people try to survive incredibly high living costs, like extreme house sharing and overcrowding.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. There's this huge tension in the academic world about this. On one hand, urban planners absolutely love what they call compact cities. They see all this densification as a massive win for sustainability. It's efficient, it cuts down carbon footprints, and it makes public transit actually viable. But on the flip side, social and legal researchers are sounding a massive alarm about what they call territorial injustice. They're warning that this intensification is actually driving severe inequality, shrinking our domestic space to unlivable extremes, and creating environments where human beings are simply packed way too tightly together.
This brings us to a major shift in how we actually study housing today. Recent legal and geographic research, like the work featured in the Journal of Social Welfare and Family Law, has started shifting the focus totally away from pure real estate economics. Instead, academics are rigorously documenting the severe human and social justice impacts of densification. They're asking the really tough questions. What actually happens when the law, property rights, and basic human needs violently collide in increasingly cramped quarters?
Let's look at how this plays out in actual policy. Take Ireland, for example. There's been this really aggressive push by developers and policymakers to build what they call small homes, which is basically just PR for shrinking the square footage of new apartments. But researchers are pointing out that these policies are almost entirely driven by financialization, maximizing the profit per square foot, and rely on deeply flawed demographic forecasting, rather than actually looking at what the population needs to live comfortably.
Meanwhile, over in England, the situation's a bit different, but honestly, just as tricky. The government there has a nationally described space standard. Sounds incredibly official and helpful, right? Well, here is the catch. They are just guidelines. They aren't prescriptive laws. Because individual local authorities get to decide how or even if they use this guidance, it creates a total geographical lottery. A home that is considered illegally small in one town might be perfectly acceptable and approved just a 10-minute drive down the road.
So, the big question we have to ask ourselves is this. When space is at an absolute luxury tier premium, and the regulations governing that space are completely inconsistent, who actually suffers the most from this squeeze? If packing us all in is inevitable, how is that burden distributed across society? When we dig into the data, the answer is unfortunately very clear and deeply unequal.
we got a really grim, undeniable answer to that question in the realm of public health. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the sheer inequality of housing space produced wildly different outcomes depending on your demographic. A severe lack of space and intense overcrowding made it practically impossible for many lower-income, working-class, and minority families to shield or self-isolate. The density of their living conditions directly, measurably drove up infection rates and, tragically, mortality.
Housing researcher Becky Tunstall hit the nail on the head here. She concluded that living cheek by jowl contributed to the total number of COVID-19 infections and deaths, and crucially, that those deaths were entirely avoidable. Having adequate, breathable living space isn't just some economic luxury or a nice-to-have aesthetic preference. When a crisis hits, spatial inequality is literally a matter of life and death.
University students are another group getting completely squeezed by this urban intensification. Researchers looking at planning decisions have noted that students are frequently treated as second-class citizens under planning laws. They're funneled into purpose-built student accommodation. Think massive, low-privacy high-rises. And the primary driver here usually isn't student well-being. It's about guaranteeing high, reliable rental yields for international investors who are cashing in on packing these buildings as tightly as legally possible.
Okay, so how is the law trying to catch up with all this? With more people chasing limited, insecure, and super expensive accommodation, the pressure to reform the private rented sector has birthed new legislation, like the Renters' Rights Act in the UK. The goal here is to try and fix a sector that has been essentially deregulated for nearly 40 years.
The big headline promise of the Renters' Rights Act is providing stability by abolishing Section 21, which most people know as no-fault evictions. Huge win, right? Well, researchers are actually quite cautious. Because the underlying market conditions of extreme unaffordability haven't changed at all, experts fully expect that removing no-fault evictions will just shift the crisis somewhere else. We're highly likely to see a sharp rise in evictions based explicitly on rent arrears, which just keeps a giant spotlight on how unbelievably unaffordable urban living has become.
Now, to fight back against terrible housing standards in this hyper-competitive market, the Act is bringing in some heavy-hitting enforcement tools. It introduces a strict hierarchy of civil penalty notices and places real enforcement duties on local authorities. But the most interesting part? It massively expands rent repayment orders. This actually empowers tenants to act almost like prosecutors, letting them claim up to 24 months of back rent if their landlord commits specific housing offenses. But, as we all know, writing a law is one thing. Actually enforcing it? Totally different story. Researchers have pointed out a glaring flaw. Individual local authorities are still the ones in the driving seat for enforcing these new rules. And right now, many of these local councils are completely gutted by years of financial austerity and a crippling national shortage of environmental health officers. You could pass the greatest housing regulations in the world, but without the boots on the ground to enforce them, that territorial injustice just keeps rolling on. And this enforcement gap gets even more alarming when you connect the dots back to health. Remember how we talked about overcrowding affecting mortality? Well, actual public health responsibilities were transferred directly to these exact same drastically underfunded local authorities back in 2013. So the very institutions that are supposed to safeguard our health in the built environment are the exact ones struggling the most to find the resources to enforce basic housing standards. Meanwhile, zooming out to the macro level, global asset managers are absolutely jumping on this crisis. They're launching massive new residential investment funds and treating housing primarily as a vehicle for surplus capital. What's wild to researchers is how successfully these massive financial institutions have framed themselves to governments as the ultimate solution to the housing crisis, completely ignoring that they are often a driving cause of the financialization forcing our homes to shrink in the first place. So, as things get more and more intense from the top down, the law at the ground level has to change too. Housing law is literally being forced to zoom in, having to micromanage the intimate, mundane, and heavily contested spaces of our daily lives. When we live this incredibly close together, the law has to constantly step in to referee noise complaints, argue over shared bins, manage antisocial behavior, and literally litigate the precise dimensions of our shrinking private spheres. I want to leave you with this to think about as we wrap up this explainer. That post-war promise of the green belts was meant to guarantee a green and pleasant land for everyone. But as those boundaries remain strictly protected and global capital keeps squeezing every drop of value out of our urban spaces, how much smaller can our homes realistically get before the social fabric just tears entirely? This isn't just about real estate. It's a profound question of health, law, and fundamental justice. When every single square inch of your life is monetized, what is the true cost of living cheek by jowl? Thanks so much for learning with me today.